Hi, my name is Petra Deeter. I am an adult child of parental alienation. As a child, I was told over and over again that my father was a monster, and I believed that. And so I didn't have a relationship with my father. Now, when I became an adult, and really much later in life, when I finally realized that that was not true, it was too late. My father had passed, so I never had the chance to have a relationship with him. Now, I'm not alone. There are millions of us out there. And I am the chair of the Heroes Circle, which is an organization that consists entirely of these members who are the adult children victims of parental alienation. Now, it is a form of child abuse. And today, I want to talk to you about parental alienation, why it is a public health problem. I also wanted to discuss a little bit about Texas, some of the consideration for legislation. Now, I have a presentation that is really meant to be for hours and hours. So I'm going to kind of skim through it, but I hope to give you a sort of some basic idea about, what parental alienation is and the severity of it. Also going to talk about how prevalent it is and how there's no protection for victims. And right now, there's no punishment. There's abusers are not being held accountable. And we're also going to talk a little bit about the legislative measures regarding parental alienation. Now, today I am a victim advocate, and I also am a researcher in parental alienation at the School of Psychological Science at the University of Tasmania. So, like I mentioned, I have a sort of a lot of slides that might be a little bit technical and potentially be boring. So I just want to say though that the key takeaway, like regardless of whatever that I'm going to be talking about, what I want you to walk away with is that parental alienation is a form of child abuse and it is a form of family violence. And the victims suffer severe consequences from this. And the problem is widespread. It is a serious public health problem. And right now, the abusers are not held accountable. So there has to be some way, some kind of measures, legislative measures, in order to stop the child abuse problem, stop family violence, and hold the abuser accountable. Now, you probably have some idea of what parental alienation is about. Essentially, it is the situation where a parent, sometimes it may not be a parent, it could be a step parent or someone else, who create a loyalty conflict, doing something to influence the child to reject a relationship with the other parent, essentially erasing the other parent out of the child's life. And create some kind of pathological enmeshment between the child and the alienating parent or the abuser or the alienator. Now, the targeted parent is being removed from the situation. And so essentially, one parent is using the child as a weapon to harm their ex-partner. This usually happens in separation and divorce. It can happen in an intact family, but it more frequently happen in a divorce or separation. Now, before the term parental alienation came about, it has been known, through clinical, legal, as well as forensic, research scientists and psychologists, psychiatrists out there in the field through many other names. So, cross-generation coalition, pathological alignment, loyalty conflict, domestic violence by proxy, visitation, resist, refuse. I mean, you see the long list there. And this here is really the point of this is that parental alienation is very real. And it doesn't matter what name you want to call it. It's been known for a long time. We know that it is a problem. It exists. It's very real. There are victims out there. And there are radical activists out there that would try to deny that parental alienation is real. But it is something that has happened. We know this, and it's been around for a long time. Now, the field of parental alienation is scientifically sound. There's decades of research into this. There's intersecting independent fields of study that intersect and come with the same conclusion. And there's thousands of peer-reviewed publication in this field. I'm going to show you some of the highlights of the finding of it. But ultimately, at the end of the day, parental alienation is a systematic multi-level attack. One parent, the alienator, is trying to harm their ex-partner, which is a targeted parent. And unfortunately, the child is being caught in the middle as a collateral damage. So, the attack can come directly from the alienator to the targeted parent. It could be in the form of denigration, gaslighting, even violent. It could come through the child, where the alienator recruit the child and get the child in the middle of this loyalty conflict, essentially making the child have to choose between the two parents. It could be in the form of abduction. It could be from the form of threats. It could be in the form of embolden the child, making the child feel like the child has a power to disrespect or even being violent to the other parent. And as a result, the child being influenced and brainwashed and programmed by the alienators, the child may reject the other parent. Sometimes the child may even spy on the targeted parent in order to find information that help the alienators in court case. Maybe information about incomes and other kind of things. And then sometimes the child will even participate in false allegation of abuse toward the targeted parents. So, the child may claim that the child was abused, even though there was no real abuse happen. Because the child has participated in the pathological enmeshment with the alienator. The boundary, the proper boundary between parent and child, between the alienator and the child is broken. And this enmeshment, this closeness is inappropriate. So, where things that should not have been exchanged between the parent and child. So, for example, discussion about sexual relationship or, cheating or financial information or court situation should not be discussed with a child, but because of the pathological enmeshment, the alienators sometimes will share this information with the child and making the child be a part of that, allegiance. And the child feels like, the alienator's goal in destroying the targeted parents is the child's all goal. You may have heard about different kind of syndrome where, abuser have managed to get the victim to take on their goals. So now the child feel like it's their job to attack the targeted parent. Now, the attack doesn't just come directly or come through the child. It can also come through the community. So like family, friends, workplace, church, things like that. So the alienator may badmouth about the targeted parent, maybe create false allegation, maybe create threats, preventing family and friends from being able to have a proper relationship with the targeted parents. And as a result, the community may reject the targeted parent. And sometimes the targeted parent will get fired from their job because of the false allegation. Sometimes the community members may be spying or participate in gaslighting that can create damage and attack on the targeted parent. And then the attack can also come through the system. So the alienators may block access to the school record or the doctor records, so the targeted parents don't get information about the child's school records. And, there could be false allegation that, multiple calls to the CPS, sometimes it's through really frivolous claims like, of neglect or abuse or something like that. Or sometimes it could be very serious false allegation of sexual or physical child abuse to the court or to the CPS, things like that. And then sometimes they will just violate the court orders. So there's different ways that alienators will abuse the targeted parents using the system. And so as a result, the system might reduce the parenting time of the targeted parents. Even when the system trying to do the right thing, even when, so when you have a false allegation, the CPS or the court have to investigate, for example, and during that investigation time, the targeted parents will lose custody of the child, because if there was, for example, a sexual allegation, there's a false allegation of sexual abuse, then the targeted parents won't have access to the child while the investigation is taking place. And sometimes this can take years. Especially when you go to the court order, to the, multiple court system, and then, false allegation after false allegation and things like that. So as a result, the system, and then sometimes the system get it wrong. And so they even take custody away from targeted parents when there's no good reason to, and then other kind of punishment that being put through the system toward the targeted parents. And then you also see that the community sometimes also participate in the system abuse to the targeted parent by enforcing, parental removal through, false allegation and things like that. So as you can see, this is a very serious form of family violence, because essentially the targeted parent is being, being attacked through multi-level and very systematic attack, and the child is being caught in the middle. Now, let's look at how parental alienation is not just family violence toward the targeted parent, but it is also a form of child abuse. So there's a study by the CDC and Kaiser Permanente. Now, thanks to thanks to COVID, we are all familiar with who CDC is. So they did a study in the 90s that it's a massive study of over 17,000 people, and they found that adverse childhood experiences, this is called the adverse childhood experience study, and their finding is this pyramid here. And they found that adverse childhood experiences, so when a child experiences things like parental separation or violence or things like that, and let's just be clear that when a child experiences false allegation of violence, the experience for the child is the same as if there was real violence. Now, if you tell the child that he or she was molested by his or her father or mother when he or she was a little child, the impact on that child is the same as if the child was actually sexually or physically abused by that parent. So, that's one of the few adverse childhood experiences that, the CDC study is violence and parental separation, and among other things. And they found that adverse childhood experiences lead to the disruption in neurodevelopment in the child. And as a result, it impaired the social and emotional and cognitive ability in the child. And then this child, as they grow up, these children, as they grow up, they adopt health risk behaviors. And then as a result, they end up with diseases and disability and social problems, and then it leads to early death. So ultimately, you can see how adverse childhood experiences can have very serious impact on people's life. It's not just psychological, but also physical. It's leading to even early death. This is a study by the CDC and Kaiser Permanente, and like I said, it's a very huge study, over 17,000 subjects. Another study by Dr. Fabricius. This study, he studied the emotional security, and this is his emotional security model, where he found that the two important factors in the emotional security in the child. One of it is a direct interaction, which means that for the child to have a good emotional security with a parent, the direct interaction between the parent and the child is very important. So if the parent doesn't have parenting time, then obviously there's no direct interaction, and then that's going to impact on the emotional security of the child. Responsiveness is another factor. So, when the child expressing happiness or sadness, and then how the parent being responsive to that is also important to the child emotional security. But in parental alienation, when the targeted parent is being blocked from text messages or phone call or things like that, then the parent's not being able to provide the responsiveness to the child. So that also impacts the emotional security to the child. And then so as a result, it impacts the emotional security. And this model, the finding from his study showed that parenting time has a direct impact on the emotional security in the child. And the more parenting time, and really the best parenting time for the child, is to have 50-50 between both parents. And this is for both high conflict as well as a low conflict situation, when you're talking about divorce cases. His study is consistent that he found that 50-50 is really the best parenting time when it comes to emotional security to the child. And like we were just talking about, emotional security play into the child development, which impact the child wellness. We're talking about both psychological and physical. Now, this is a very big slide with a lot of information. I just wanted to highlight what I just mentioned and why parental alienation is a form of child abuse, because parental alienation create parental conflict, parental separation, false memories of abuse and violence, things like that. And so this slide here is actually the intersection of multiple fields of study, including, for example, studies on divorce, looking at parental conflicts and separation. There's a study on child development that looking at attachment theory. There's a study on trauma that looking at developmental trauma and interpersonal trauma. So they found essentially the same outcome, which is parental alienation, or these factors in parental alienation create physiologic and neuroendocrine system dysregulation. So it impacting the the stress, essentially what it is it creates the chronic triggering of the stress response in the children. And so it dysregulates. So, it affects the cognitive function in the child. It essentially, we as a human being have a stress response system. The way it does is that it signal you when you need to be alert when there's an imminent threat, and sometimes it could be a long-term threat. But when this system is being chronically triggered, then it's going to dysregulate this system so that the child is constantly on alert. And then that in return will impact the system and the organs. So, the immune system, the heart and cardiovascular system functioning, the brain and nervous system in the child. So this child is developing growing in with all these impairments, and then it creates short and long-term psychological and physical impacts. So you can understand the psychological impact of it, like how the child might suffer from acute stress disorder, PTSD, depression, suicidal, alcohol dependency and substance abuse, things like that, self-esteem and trust issues. But not only that, it manifests into physical form of impairments. So it's including, cardiovascular diseases, obesity, cancer, things like that. So the victim, suffer from short and long-term psychological and physical impact. And then as a result, they have this impact is creating cost on the personal level as well as the society level, because this human being is now have a social economic attainment impairment. So they are not being able to attain as high, because they're not fully performing human being. So, and then they have poor relationships, and then that also impacts their contribution to society. And we're not even talking about the society cost to the physical and psychological illness that was impacted by parental alienation. So as a result, really, you can see that parental alienation is a form of child abuse. And there's a study by Dr. Spinazzola that looked at over 5,000 children who would suffer from both over 5,000 children, that looking at children that was subjected to psychological abuse, physical abuse, and sexual abuse. And he found that psychological abuse is a strong and consistent predictor of internalizing problems in adulthood. That means children who are suffering from psychological abuse will likely to grow up to have anxiety, depression, attachment problems, substance abuse, self-esteem issue, relationship insecurity, suicidal ideation, etc., etc. So that's one of the outcome of the study, which means that the child is suffering not just the psychological abuse as a child, but this carry on with them for the lifetime. And this is, this horrific form of abuse is manifesting into all other aspects of their life. Another outcome of this very important study is that he found that child psychological abuse has the same impact and the same damage in these children as physical abuse or sexual abuse. Now, let me just repeat that. Child psychological abuse had the same consequences, the same seriousness as physical abuse and sexual abuse. And yet, as a society, we somehow usually overlook psychological abuse. Now, if we hear a child is being sexually abused or physical abuse, the reaction to that is very high, and there's usually some kind of solution that's very clear-cut. And society are willing to go and protect that child. But when it comes to child psychological abuse, as a system, somehow we overlook this. So the key takeaway from what I'm just talking about is that parental alienation is child abuse, and that we are not actually paying attention to it. It's a very serious problem. And unfortunately, the problem is very widespread. I don't want to just walk through all these numbers here, but I just wanted to kind of highlight a little bit is that the number is huge. And these are the numbers that I'm talking about just in Texas. We're talking about nearly 2 million parents who are victims of parental alienation. And we're looking at all these different level and different form of children who are victims of parental alienation. And this number here don't even including people like me who are the adult children of parental alienation. So the problem is very widespread, and yet we don't talk about it. We don't have solution for it. It is serious, it's widespread, it is a public health problem, and it needs attention. Now, we have a certain number of laws out there that are really good we already have existing laws. So for example, Texas Family Code, section 261, define that mental or emotional injury to a child is a form of abuse. Unfortunately, and it's supposedly the investigation for child abuse is handled by Department of Family and Protective Services. But yet when it comes to process a procedure for investigating or handling psychological abuse, there's no clear procedure or processes. We actually had a meeting with the Department of Family and Protective Services, and they essentially said, we don't really have anything like that. Well, let us look into it, but it's not very clear. If you ask them about sexual or physical abuse, it's very clear to them. They investigate, they take the child away, they do something about it, they put parents into training classes, etc., etc. But when it comes to mental or emotional injury to the child, the department just go, oh, maybe this is not a form of abuse, which is really serious. You look at, for example, Montgomery County Sheriff's Office, we look at law enforcement. This is their policy manual. They don't look at child, psychological abuse as a form of child abuse. You look at the definition here, there's physical, there's sexual abuse, but there's no mental abuse. You look at, for example, this is another thing is domestic violence. The definition, the policy manual looking at domestic violence, it's the same thing. There's bodily injury, there's this and that, there's sexual act, but there's no psychological abuse. Now you're looking at Penal Code 22, which is looking at child abuse from the criminal side of things. You're looking at injury to a child. Again, there's no mention of mental or emotional injury. It's being left out. So and then you're looking at so for example, Penal Code 25. There's all these subsection that talking about interference of child custody. This is these are existing law out there that defining that interfering with a child custody is a form of criminal offense, but yet parents are facing a really rough time trying to get the enforcement, because the law enforcement is looking at this as a civil matter. In fact, it is not a civil matter. It's in the penal code. And we look at how widespread this is. We pulled the open records request, and we found that in, for example, San Antonio alone, there's average 1,000 cases a month. So you're looking at the whole Texas, the number is a lot bigger than this. It's a very serious and widespread problem, and we are not doing anything about it. So for example, this is the field policy and procedure manual by the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office. And again, they clearly put in writing that they are not going to enforce the court order. They're going to, when it comes to child custody, they're going to send parents back to court. I mean, like, why? Because parents already went to court in order to have this court order that was supposedly have been determined based on the child's best interest. And yet now they're not able to enforce this. So there's a non-enforcement. And then obviously, there's all this penal code that looking at perjury when it comes to false allegation. And, these targeted parents are being thrown into hell when you get being accused of false allegation with false allegation of, sexual abuse or physical abuse of a child. It's very serious. You could lose your life because, you lose your reputation, you lose your job, you spend so much money and time, and you could end up in jail, trying to fight this. And then after they have gone through and do all that in order to fight and defend themselves, and prove that this was false allegation, there was nobody go and enforce. There's no persecution for perjury. And so, we have law in place that not being applied. And then we, for example, talked to the Texas Children Commission. This is the Supreme Court of Texas Children Commission. It's a state organization that's funded by the federal government in order to educate the commissioners. And they don't even recognize that parental alienation is child abuse. They said, we only deal with child welfare. And we said, okay, yeah, parental alienation is child welfare. And we try to explain to them the way that I kind of try to explain to you today. And it's the same thing. So they look at it and they said, oh, we do see that now. We understand that is child abuse. But unfortunately, it's not defined within the four corners of the law as child abuse. And this is, quote, exactly what they said to us, is that their hands are tied because it's not being defined in the law. I mean, there's really a lot of system failure modes. The system failed to recognize that parental alienation is child abuse. It's the first biggest problem. And because of that, there's no protection or resources for victims or survivors. There's no punishment for abusers. There's a lack of enforcement of the existing law, like I mentioned. And then there's a lengthy and expensive court process the children age out in the process, and then the children carry on with them this impact in their life for the rest of their life. And then there's incentive reversal, meaning, for example, if you're looking at lawyers, right? Lawyers are getting paid if the court case drag out. So lawyers are incentivized to encourage adversarial court cases. They don't want parents to be able to settle cases quickly because then they don't get paid as much. So in the incentive is not in the best interest of the victims here. And then the lack of awareness at all levels. We're talking about not just the public, but also, we're talking about therapists, school teacher, law enforcement officer, judges. At all levels, there's a lack of awareness of what this problem is and how serious it is, and because of that, there's a lack of ability to identify and diagnose the problem properly. And then obviously, there's also this gender bias. Like if there's an allegation of sexual abuse, and if it was a father that being accused of this, the study have shown that he's more likely people more likely to believe that. And then also study that show that if a mother is being accused of being emotionally unstable, then also people tend to believe that easier. So there's this gender bias that we all carry around that affecting how we're looking at this problem. And then obviously, whether we wanted to acknowledge or not, there are some level of corruption at places. So there's many ways that the system failed to protect the children. So right now, there's no protection for victims, and there's no punishment for abuser. So there have to be some kind of legislative measures in order to fix this problem. Some of the things that these are just suggestions that I would like to propose, which is, we have certain laws that could help minimize this problem. So, if we could enforce some kind of existing law, the existing laws that we talk about, that if we could have some kind of legislation to help enforcement of the existing law, custody interference and perjury, things like that. If we could help with parenting time, because like we saw earlier, parenting time is going to help with child emotional security. And when the child have secure emotional security, then the child can develop more healthy. And then at the same time, it also prevents the child from being affected by parental alienation. So having some legislation that's supporting parenting time is also important. And then recognizing that parental alienation is child abuse. This is so big, this is so important. And then if we can have that, then we can start to have resources and education. We need education for children. So if we can have legislation where that put in where children should be educated about, it doesn't, not just parental alienation, but how to deal with parental conflict. We have so many children who are affected by divorces. How do children should handle in divorce situation? Education for parents. How do they handle their children during divorce? Because sometimes abusers are doing this unintentionally. Sometimes it's because they don't realize what they're doing. They don't realize the damage to their children. They don't realize that this is wrong. So education for parents is also very important. And then obviously education for professional, because the lack of awareness at all levels. So if we can have education for judges, CPS worker, law enforcement, teachers, things like that. And then obviously resources for victims and survivors. So like I mentioned, I want you to walk away from my talk is that parental alienation is child abuse and family violence, and the victims suffer from severe consequences, and the problem is very widespread. It is a serious public health problem because of how severe it is, how long-term impact it is, and how widespread it is. And right now, abusers are currently not held accountable, and there's no solution or protection for the children. So legislative measures are needed. Thank you so much for listening.